Howdy, folks. Welcome to Tuesday's Tips. My name is Kenneth Thomas, and today being Tuesday, I'm going to give you some tips in photo, lighting, video, and photography. And as you may have noticed from the title, we're going to be talking about stops. Stop! All right. So, first thing I want to say, though, is that if you are watching this on Facebook and you want to be able to comment and have me respond to your comments, you need to go to streamyard.com/Facebook. Give Facebook permission to see who you are. That way, when you pop up on my comments, I'll know who you are, and I can engage with you during this video. So, anyway, what is a stop? A lot of people, you hear people talking about stops and in photography and that kind of stuff, and basically, what a stop is it's a standard that lets you compare three different things. Okay. Exposure is controlled by shutter speed, how fast the camera pops open, the aperture, how big the opening is that's letting the light in, and the ISO speed, which is the sensitivity of either the film, if you're using film, or the sensitivity setting for the digital sensor in your digital cameras. Now, these are all measured in different things. What a stop is it allows you to directly compare and swap these to produce the image that you want. And I'm going to explain a little bit about how that works here in just a little bit. Now, basically, a stop is a doubling when you're increasing your stops, or having, when you're decreasing your stops, the amount of light that you're letting in when you're taking a photo, okay? So when a photographer says he's going to increase his exposure by one stop, that simply means he's going to get twice as much light in as the previous shot. And he can do this by three different things, okay? So that's going to bring us to the exposure triangle, all right? Now, shutter speed measures how long your camera shutter is left open during the shot, okay? And this is measured usually in fractions of a second. If you're doing night photography or some other kind of special stuff, you may be using very long exposures. But for the most part, we're doing seconds or less. Okay. ISO speed, like I said, it describes how sensitive your camera's sensor or the film, if you're shooting film that you're using, is to the light that it receives. Now, aperture is measured using an F number. Now, these are called f-stops usually. And this basically describes the diameter of the aperture. Now, here's the crazy thing. The smaller the number, like an f4, is a very large opening, okay? Whereas a very high number, like an f22, is a very, very small opening, okay? Now, there's some other different things that this exposure triangle does, okay? So I've got this handy dandy little guide here I'm going to pop up. Now, what an exposure triangle allows you to do is like, okay, shutter speed determines how blurry or sharp an image is going to be based on the time that it takes to capture. If you want to freeze something like a sports image or something like that, then you're going to want to have a very fast shutter speed, okay? If you want to have some kind of blur showing the motion, then you're going to want a slower shutter speed. You've seen a lot of those nice, where you got like a creek or a stream or a river, or especially going over rocks and stuff. And it's a very creamy looking, the water looks really creamy and kind of dreamy and that kind of stuff. Well, that's done using a slower shutter speed. Okay. So that's an example of where you might want to just blur the motion a little bit, because everything else except for the water is standing still. So it gives you this really beautiful effect. Okay. Now with aperture, you're controlling your depth of field. Okay. So with shutter speed, you're determining how you capture motion. Aperture is allowing you to determine depth of field. Now, depth of field, what I mean by that is how much from your subject to the rest of the image is in focus, okay? A shallow depth of field you see this a lot of times with really nice portrait photography and that kind of stuff, where you'll see somebody, they're nice and sharp in focus and everything else, but the background's kind of blurry and dreamy looking. That's a shallow depth of field, okay? Now, if you have the person and then everything all the way to the horizon is in focus, that is a deep depth of field, okay? And a deep depth of field comes from a very small aperture, which is the higher number, and a shallow depth of field comes from the lower numbers, which is the bigger openings, okay? Now, with this, we also have your ISO sensitivity. Now, this is really something that you can do a lot of things with, okay? Most of the time, you want to be shooting around 100, 200, 400, okay? And the reason is because these are going to have less grain. They're going to be sharper, okay? They're less sensitive, but they're going to be a little bit cleaner in their resolution. Okay, when you get to, like, it's on the far side over here, when you get to the higher ISO numbers, you're bringing in a lot of sensitivity, but the problem is you also get a lot of noise, okay? So there's going to be a lot of grain, there's going to be a lot of that kind of thing going on in your image. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're doing this. Now, the reason this matters is say that you know that you want to have a shallow depth of field, and you want to freeze the motion, okay? So that tells you that you need to have a large aperture and a fast shutter speed. So that usually going to work for you. But where this really plays into and why the triangle is so important for a photographer is understanding that, okay, I just took this picture, I look at it, it's not what I want. So what is it that you want to do? Okay, well, the exposure looks right, but I don't want the image to be blurry. So that means I need to increase my shutter speed, okay? So when you increase your shutter speed, you're moving up stops, okay? Now you got to remember your exposure was right. The way the light was on your subject was the way you wanted it. It was too blurry, so you needed faster shutter speed. So you have two choices that you can do here. You're going to increase your shutter speed by, say, 1 stop. Now, to get the exposure to be the same way, you're going to have to change one of two things, okay? You're either going to need to decrease your ISO by 1 stop, or you're going to need to increase your ISO by 1 stop, since you are speeding up the shutter speed. You got to remember, look at the arrows where it says brighter. So if you're moving to where you're less bright because you're going faster, then you need to do something to increase your brightness, okay? So you can do that by either increasing your ISO by 1 stop or by increasing your aperture by 1 stop, okay? So this is where that kind of plays into and how photographers will use that. Now, so anytime you use on one of these three things, you increase by a stop. Somewhere else, you need to decrease by a stop if you want your exposure to stay the same. Conversely, say your exposure isn't enough. Well, if you're wanting to keep that freeze motion of the fast shutter speed, then that means you either need to open up your aperture some more, or you need to increase your ISO so that way you're catching more light. So it kind of plays. Now, where this really comes in for a photographer, kind of comes in with the Sunny 16 rule. All right. Now, this is basically kind of a rule of thumb, kind of a starting point for a photographer when they're wanting to determine how they're going to set their camera up to shoot outdoors. On a sunny day, you set your aperture to f16, and that's why it's called the Sunny 16 rule. And what you're going to set your shutter speed to is 1 over ISO. So what that means is, say you're using an ISO setting of 200, You're going to set your f-stop to your aperture to f16. You're going to set your shutter speed to 1 over ISO. Your ISO is 200, so 1 over 200. And then that will give you the proper exposure for a subject that's in direct sunlight on a sunny day. Okay? Now, say it's not a sunny day. Okay? Well, what kind of day are we talking about? If you're talking about, slightly overcast, it's going to be a little, you look at your shadows, okay? If your shadows are distinct, you've got a clear sunny day, F16, that's your starting point. If you're slightly overcast, so you can get soft around edges and that kind of stuff in your shadows, you're going to need to increase that by a stop, okay? And you can do that by either decreasing your shutter speed or increasing your ISO or increasing your aperture. And a lot of times we just do it with the aperture so that way we can get to where we have our exposure the way we need it for that. And then we can go and say, okay, but I want a shallow depth of field. So that means I need to open that up even further, which means I'm going to have to speed up my shot to keep the exposure the way I want, or we're going to have to decrease the ISO. So that's where that exposure triangle comes into, okay? So you use this as kind of a starting point, and then you can make your settings from there. And basically, if you have a clear sunny day, you're starting at F16. If it's slightly overcast, you're going to stop it down 1. So F11. If you're going to have, if it's really overcast, you're going to have it step it down to an F8. If it's like super overcast, then you're going to have to step that down to like an F5.6. And then if it's open shade or if it's sunset, you're shooting at an F4, and that's for 1 over ISO. Okay. So, and then from there, you can make your adjustments as you need to when going into, how you want to set up your shot. Okay. So basically a stop is just a way that we can use, that way we know what we're changing to keep the exposure the same or to adjust the exposure. We need to move up a stop or down a stop. So we know that means if I'm going up a stop, that means I'm either going to double my time or I'm going to double my aperture, or I'm going to double my ISO. If I need to go down, that means I'm going to half my shutter speed, I'm going to half my aperture, or I'm going to half my ISO. So basically it tells you how you're moving on this triangle. All right. And it also tells you how, if you finally get the way you want your exposure to be, it tells you how to change things so that you can get the depth of field or the blur motion or freeze motion that you want. So that's basically what a stop is. It's basically a term that we use so that way we can know what we're doing with these 3 different things: shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. So that way we can get the effect and the visual that we want, and know how to work with the exposure that we've got. So that's pretty much what a stop is and why it's important for a photographer to understand. Now, again, these are all things I'm talking about using, for the most part, an SLR camera, either a digital SLR or a film SLR camera, where you're setting these things manually. Okay. Everybody's a photographer until you set it to manual. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking at here. Now, I'm going to be ending all my videos with bringing this up, this month. This is the phone number for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. If you or someone you know is dealing with suicide or suicidal thoughts, call 1-800-273-TALK and get some help. Okay. These guys are there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's somebody there to answer the phone, and they will be there to help you out, because you may not think it right now, but suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary situation. Okay. So people are going to miss you when you're gone. You may not think so, but I guarantee you there are people who will miss you. All right. So until next time, folks, peace, love, and photography. And remember, everything can make a beautiful image, including you. You guys have a great afternoon, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.